It's 72 hours after the last warhead detonates. Somewhere in a basement outside of Buenos Aires, a family emerges into daylight for the first time in 3 days. The father shields his eyes. The mother holds her daughter's hand. Above them, the sky's the wrong colour. They are 10,000 kilometres from the nearest blast site. They survived. But surviving the war and surviving what comes after are two completely different things. Most people imagine nuclear war as an ending, a flash of light, then nothing. But for the majority of humanity, nuclear war wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of something far worse. This is the story of what happens after, not the flash of the bombs, not the mushroom clouds, not the immediate destruction that we've all imagined 1,000 times in movies and nightmares. This is about the years that follow, the slow catastrophe that would unfold even in places untouched by any warhead. The way human civilization might unravel not in seconds, but over seasons. A global nuclear conflict would divide human history into 2 parts, everything before and everything after. This wouldn't be like the World Wars, it wouldn't be like the Black Death or the fall of Rome. Those were catastrophic events, but civilization continued. Knowledge was preserved. The basic machinery of human society kept turning. Consider what the Black Death did to Europe. It killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the population over the course of several years. Cities emptied. Economies collapsed. Social structures that had existed for centuries were swept away. And yet, within a few generations, Europe recovered. The survivors inherited empty land and abandoned wealth. Labour became scarce and therefore valuable. Some historians argue that the Black Death actually accelerated Europe's development by breaking the feudal system. A full-scale nuclear exchange between major powers would be something else entirely. It would kill more people in a single day than every war in human history combined, and then the real damage would begin. To understand why, we have to start at the beginning, the moment of detonation. A modern thermonuclear warhead releases its energy in roughly 0.3 seconds. At the point of detonation, temperatures reach approximately 100 million degrees Celsius. This is 6 times hotter than the core of the sun. Everything within a certain radius simply ceases to exist. Steel, concrete, and human tissue are converted into superheated gas. Extending outward from this point is the thermal radiation zone. Within this area, exposed skin receives third-degree burns instantly. Clothing and paper spontaneously ignite. Trees burst into flame. The thermal pulse travels at the speed of light, arriving before any warning is possible. Behind the light comes the pressure wave. This wall of compressed air travels faster than the speed of sound. Buildings are flattened. Cars are thrown like toys. Human bodies are torn apart by forces they were never designed to withstand. A single warhead with a yield of 800 kilotons, a common size in modern arsenals, would create a fireball roughly 2 kilometers in diameter. The pressure wave would level reinforced concrete buildings within a radius of about 3 kilometers. Third-degree burns would occur at distances up to 8 kilometers from the blast. For comparison, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima had a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. Modern warheads are 50 times more powerful. A single modern submarine can carry enough warheads to destroy every major city on a continent. The destruction would not be limited to the immediate blast zones. Electromagnetic pulses from high-altitude detonations would fry electronics across vast areas. Power grids would fail. Communications would go dark. In the chaos following the initial exchange, there would be no way to coordinate rescue efforts, no way to organize evacuation, no way to know which cities still existed and which had been erased. In a single exchange involving thousands of warheads, this happened simultaneously in hundreds of locations across multiple continents. Within the first hour, somewhere between 300 million and 500 million people die. But these deaths represent only about 5% of the total casualties that would eventually result from a large-scale nuclear war. Because of what happens next. Every nuclear detonation over a city ignites thousands of individual fires, buildings burn, gas lines rupture and explode, fuel depots detonate, forests at the city's edge catch fire. Normally, fires burn out when they exhaust their fuel, or when firefighters contain them, but when enough fires burn in close proximity, something else happens. They merge. This is not speculation. We have observed this phenomenon in nature and in war. The physics are well understood. A firestorm is not simply a large fire. It is a self-sustaining weather system. As the flames consume oxygen, they create an updraft of superheated air, that can reach speeds of over 200 kilometers per hour. This updraft pulls in fresh oxygen from the surrounding area, feeding the fire further. The inrushing winds can reach hurricane force. We have seen this phenomenon before. In 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo created a firestorm that killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night. The bombing of Dresden in 1945 created similar conditions. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki both triggered firestorms. The temperatures at the centre of a nuclear firestorm can exceed 1000 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, everything organic is consumed. People in underground shelters can die from asphyxiation, as the fire above consumes all available oxygen. Others die from carbon monoxide poisoning. Others simply cook. In a large-scale nuclear exchange, firestorms would ignite across dozens or hundreds of cities simultaneously. The fires would burn for days. Some would burn for weeks, and as they burn, they lift something into the sky. Fire produces smoke, but the smoke from a nuclear firestorm is different from ordinary smoke. When a city burns, it doesn't just consume wood and paper. It consumes plastics, synthetic materials, asphalt roads, fuel reserves, industrial chemicals. The resulting smoke is dense with black carbon particles called soot. In a normal fire, smoke rises a few kilometers into the atmosphere, where it's eventually washed out by rain. The process takes days or weeks, but the updraft from a firestorm doesn't stop at the lower atmosphere. The heat from burning cities creates pyrocumulonimbus clouds. These are storm systems generated by fire itself. They can reach heights of 15 to 20 kilometers, punching through the troposphere and into the stratosphere. The troposphere is where weather happens. It extends from the surface to about 10 or 12 kilometers up. Above it sits the stratosphere, a layer of stable dry air that extends up to about 50 kilometers. The stratosphere is the layer of atmosphere above the weather. There are no clouds here, there is no rain. There is no mechanism to wash particles back down to Earth. Once soot particles reach the stratosphere, they don't come back down, they stay. Studies using climate models estimate that a full-scale nuclear war would inject between 150 and 180 million metric tons of soot into the stratosphere. This black layer would spread across the globe within weeks, carried by stratospheric winds, and then something would change about the sky. Black carbon absorbs sunlight. With 150 million tons of soot suspended in the stratosphere, somewhere between 70 and 90% of incoming solar radiation would be blocked from reaching the Earth's surface. This isn't darkness. The sun would still be visible, but it would appear dim, like looking at it through heavily tinted glass. At midday, the light levels would resemble those of a heavily overcast winter afternoon. Shadows would be faint or non-existent. The effect on global temperatures would be immediate. Within the first month, average global temperatures would drop by approximately 7 to 8 degrees Celsius. To put this in perspective, the difference between now and the peak of the last ice age was about 5 degrees, but the ice age took thousands of years to develop. Ecosystems had time to adapt. Species migrated. Evolution did its slow work. Plants and animals that couldn't survive moved or died out gradually, replaced by species better suited to the new conditions. Nuclear winter would arrive in weeks. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, temperatures could drop by 20 to 30 degrees. Summers would see frost. Growing seasons would effectively disappear. In some regions, temperatures would remain below freezing year-round. The oceans would cool more slowly than the land, creating massive temperature differentials. Weather patterns would become unpredictable and extreme. Some areas would experience violent storms. Others would see almost no precipitation at all. The ozone layer would also be damaged. Nitrogen oxides produced by the fireballs would catalyze the destruction of stratospheric ozone. This would allow more ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface, radiation that damages plants, causes skin cancer, and weakens immune systems. The survivors would face not just cold and darkness, but also increased exposure to harmful UV rays once the soot began to clear. This would not be a permanent ice age. The soot would eventually settle out of the stratosphere as particles slowly aggregate and fall. Climate models suggest the worst effects would last between 2 and 10 years, with full recovery taking a decade or more. But for the humans trying to survive during that period, the distinction between temporary and permanent would be academic. Human civilization exists because of agriculture. Everything else, cities, technology, culture, science, is built on top of our ability to grow food at scale. Modern agriculture is optimized for modern conditions. Crop varieties are selected for specific temperature ranges, specific amounts of sunlight, specific rainfall patterns. Wheat grows best between 15 and 20 degrees Celsius. Corn requires at least 10 degrees to germinate. Rice needs warm water and plenty of sun. In nuclear winter conditions, every one of these variables would shift outside the range that crops can tolerate. The reduced sunlight alone would devastate photosynthesis. Plants convert solar energy into chemical energy. With 70 to 90% less sunlight, this process slows dramatically. Growth rates collapse. Plants that do manage to grow produce less grain, fewer seeds, smaller yields. The temperature drop would compound this effect. Most staple crops, wheat, rice, corn, soybeans, require temperatures above certain thresholds to germinate and mature. Summer frost would kill seedlings. Early winters would kill plants before they could produce grain. Even in tropical regions, the cooling would push temperatures below what many crops can survive. Reduced sunlight also means reduced evaporation from oceans. This means less rainfall. Global precipitation could decline by 30 to 50%. Regions that depend on monsoon rains would see them weaken or fail entirely. The monsoons that feed South and Southeast Asia, that water the crops that feed billions of people, would diminish. Climate simulations have modelled crop yields under nuclear winter conditions. The results are consistent across multiple studies. In the first year after a large-scale nuclear war, global corn production would decline by approximately 90%. Wheat production would decline by roughly 80%. Rice production would decline by about 40% in the first year, then continue falling as soil temperatures drop. This would continue for years. 8 billion people live on Earth. The food that sustains them does not come from 8 billion small farms. It comes from a handful of highly productive regions: the American Midwest, the North China Plain, the Indo-Gangetic Plain of India and Pakistan, the Black Sea region of Ukraine and Russia, the Pampas of Argentina, the Murray-Darling Basin of Australia. These regions produce the majority of the world's staple crops. The food they grow is shipped globally through an interconnected system of ports, railways and shipping lanes. A farmer in Iowa grows corn that feeds livestock in Japan. Wheat from Ukraine becomes bread in Egypt. Soybeans from Brazil become cooking oil in China. This system is efficient. It keeps food prices low and ensures that even countries with poor agricultural land can feed their populations. It is also fragile. Most countries maintain grain reserves measured in weeks, not months. The global food system operates on the assumption that next season's harvest will arrive on schedule. Supermarkets stock 3 to 5 days of food at any given time. There is no backup plan for a scenario where harvests fail simultaneously across every major agricultural region for multiple consecutive years. The entire architecture of modern civilization assumes continuity. Farmers plant expecting to harvest. Governments plan assuming trade will continue. Populations grow expecting food supply to keep pace. Remove these assumptions and everything begins to unravel. We have seen glimpses of how quickly this system can break down. In 2010, a drought in Russia destroyed much of the wheat harvest. Russia banned exports. Food prices spiked globally. The price increases contributed to unrest across North Africa and the Middle East, unrest that became the Arab Spring. That was a single regional crop failure lasting one season. In the aftermath of a nuclear war, crop failures would be global and would last for years. Even if the climate effects of nuclear war were somehow mitigated, modern agriculture would still collapse. This is because farming today is not performed by farmers with ploughs. It is performed by machines running on diesel fuel, applying fertilizers derived from natural gas, spraying pesticides manufactured in chemical plants, using seeds produced by a specialized agricultural industry. Every one of these inputs depends on global supply chains. Diesel fuel comes from refineries. Most refineries are located near major cities or along coastlines. In a nuclear exchange, these would be primary targets. The refineries that survive would lose access to crude oil as tanker ships stop sailing and pipelines are disrupted. Synthetic fertilizers require the Haber-Bosch process, which consumes enormous amounts of natural gas. This single industrial process is responsible for producing the nitrogen fertilizer that grows roughly half of the world's food. The plants that produce these fertilizers are concentrated in specific regions. The pipelines that feed them natural gas would be disrupted. Without synthetic nitrogen, crop yields would collapse even in perfect weather. Pesticides are manufactured in chemical plants. Spare parts for tractors are produced in factories. Seeds are processed and distributed through logistics networks. Irrigation systems require electricity to run pumps. None of this infrastructure would survive a large-scale nuclear war intact. Even in regions far from any blast site, farmers would run out of fuel within weeks. Fertilizer supplies would not be replenished. Tractors that break down would stay broken. Seeds saved from previous harvests might germinate. But without fertilizer and pesticides, yields would be a fraction of normal. Agricultural output would collapse, not because the land was irradiated, but because the system that makes modern farming possible would cease to function. This is the cruel irony. Most of the world's farmland would survive a nuclear war physically intact. The soil would still be there. The water would still flow. Given seeds, labour and time, crops could still grow. But modern agriculture doesn't work with seeds, labour and time alone. It works because of a vast industrial ecosystem that would no longer exist. This brings us to a calculation that no one wants to perform. The human body requires approximately 2,000 calories per day to survive. Less than this, and the body begins to consume itself. Muscles waste. Organs fail. The immune system collapses. Death from starvation typically occurs after losing about 40% of normal body weight, a process that takes weeks to months depending on initial health and conditions. 8 billion people times 2,000 calories per day equals 16 trillion calories every day. In the aftermath of a large-scale nuclear war, global food production would drop to somewhere between 10 and 20% of normal levels. This would continue for years. The math does not allow for the survival of 8 billion people on 10 to 20% of a normal food supply. The math allows for the survival of approximately 1 to 2 billion people. The remaining 6 to 7 billion would die, not from nuclear fire, not from radiation, not from the initial blasts, from hunger. Starvation is not a quick death. The body first burns through its glycogen reserves, then begins breaking down fat stores, then starts consuming muscle tissue. As the body weakens, the immune system fails. Many people would die not from starvation itself, but from diseases their weakened bodies could no longer fight. Cholera, typhoid, influenza, infections from minor wounds. The psychological effects would be equally devastating. Parents would watch their children starve. Communities would fracture as people competed for dwindling resources. The social bonds that hold civilizations together would dissolve under the pressure of survival. This would happen over a period of months to years. It would happen everywhere. It would be the largest loss of human life in history by an order of magnitude, and it would not be evenly distributed. The Northern Hemisphere contains the majority of the world's population, the majority of its industrial capacity, and the majority of its nuclear targets. It would also bear the worst effects of nuclear winter. Climate models show temperature drops would be most severe in the mid-latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere, precisely where the world's most productive agricultural regions are located. The Southern Hemisphere would fare somewhat better. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and parts of southern Africa are geographically distant from likely target zones. They have lower population densities and, in some cases, significant livestock that could provide protein when crops fail. Australia alone has roughly 25 million cattle and 70 million sheep, far more animals than people. But somewhat better does not mean unaffected. Nuclear winter would be a global phenomenon. The soot layer would spread across both hemispheres. Temperature drops in the southern hemisphere would be smaller but still significant. Perhaps 4 to 6 degrees instead of 8 to 10. More importantly, these countries would face waves of desperate refugees. They would face pressure to export food to starving populations elsewhere. They would face the collapse of the global trade networks they depend on for manufactured goods, medicine, and technology. They would face the choice of whether to share their limited resources or to seal their borders. History suggests how nations behave when their own survival is at stake. In 1943, during the Bengal famine, the British colonial government prioritised feeding its military forces over the local population. 3 million people died. In 1932, the Soviet government exported grain from Ukraine while millions of Ukrainians starved to death. When resources become scarce, those who control them rarely share willingly. The post-nuclear world would see this pattern repeated. Countries with remaining food production would face impossible choices: share their food and potentially starve themselves, or hoard it and watch neighbouring populations die. Nations that had never fought each other might go to war over access to arable land, fresh water, and surviving infrastructure. Not every nuclear conflict would involve thousands of warheads. A regional nuclear war, say between India and Pakistan, might involve 100 to 200 warheads, with yields in the 15 to 100 kiloton range. This is a fraction of the arsenals held by the United States and Russia. Such a war would still kill tens of millions of people immediately. The cities of the Indian subcontinent are densely populated. A 50 kiloton weapon over Mumbai would kill more people than the Hiroshima bomb killed. The firestorms from 100 to 200 burning cities would inject approximately 5 to 15 million tons of soot into the stratosphere. This would produce a nuclear autumn rather than a full nuclear winter. Global temperatures would drop by 1 to 3 degrees Celsius. Growing seasons would shorten. Crop yields would decline by 10 to 30% for several years. In a world where 2 billion people already experience food insecurity, a 10 to 30% decline in global food production would be catastrophic. It would trigger famines across multiple continents. It would destabilize governments. It would kill hundreds of millions of people through secondary effects. And there is another consideration. Regional nuclear wars do not necessarily stay regional. Allies become involved. Escalation pressures mount. The weapons exist. The delivery systems exist. Both India and Pakistan continue to expand their arsenals. A war that begins with 100 warheads can become a war that involves thousands. This is not paranoia. It is how military planners think. Once nuclear weapons are used, the taboo is broken. The side that is losing has every incentive to escalate. The side that is winning has every incentive to strike first before the enemy can escalate. The logic of nuclear war pushes toward total war. Imagine a world 5 years after a large-scale nuclear war. The nuclear winter is beginning to lift. Temperatures are slowly returning toward normal. The sun is visible again. The human population has declined from 8 billion to perhaps 1.5 billion. Entire nations have effectively ceased to exist. Major cities are ruins or mass graves. The survivors are concentrated in regions that were able to maintain some food production. The southern hemisphere, some coastal areas, scattered communities that found ways to adapt. The world these survivors inherit would be unrecognizable. The internet would not exist. Most satellites would have failed or gone silent. The electrical grid would be gone in most regions. The factories that produce medicine, electronics, vehicles, and countless other goods would be silent. Antibiotics would become unavailable. Diseases that had been treatable would become death sentences again. The knowledge would still exist, in books, in the memories of surviving engineers and scientists. But the infrastructure to apply that knowledge would have to be rebuilt from scratch, and rebuilding would require resources, coordination, and stability that might not exist. Some historians believe human civilization could recover within a century or two. Others argue that certain resources, easily accessible fossil fuels, mineral deposits, topsoil, have already been depleted by our current civilization. A second industrial revolution might not be possible. The survivors might be locked into a pre-industrial existence permanently. We don't know. We can't know. What we do know is that the survivors would inherit a world scarred not just physically, but psychologically. The trauma of watching billions die, of losing family members, communities, entire nations, would mark generations. The knowledge that humanity had done this to itself would hang over every attempt to rebuild. Languages would be lost, cultures would vanish. The accumulated artistic and intellectual heritage of thousands of years would be reduced to whatever happened to survive in scattered libraries and the memories of survivors. Much of what we consider human civilization would simply cease to exist. What we know is that the survivors would live in a damaged world, with fewer resources, less knowledge, and the memory of what their species had done to itself. Remember the family we started with. The one emerging from their basement 72 hours after the war? They survived the blasts. They will probably survive the immediate radiation effects. They're too far from any detonation site. They will watch the sky turn grey over the following weeks. They will feel the temperature drop. They will hear the news, fragments of it from whatever communications still function, about what happened to the Northern Hemisphere. They will go to stores and find them empty. They will see their government struggling to maintain order. They will watch food prices rise beyond anything they can afford. They will see neighbours begin to hoard. They will hear about violence in the cities as people fight over what remains. Argentina has significant agricultural capacity. It has livestock. It has a relatively low population density. By the standards of the post-war world, they are in one of the better positions. They might survive. Their daughter might grow up in a world fundamentally different from the one she was born into. She might never see a working smartphone. She might never fly on an airplane. She might spend her adult life farming land with hand tools, struggling against shortened growing seasons, living a life that would have been unimaginable to her grandparents, or they might not survive at all. We don't know their names, we don't know their faces, they're just one family among billions. But when we talk about nuclear war, we're talking about them. We're talking about every family, every child, every person who would watch their world collapse around them through no fault of their own. The decisions that could lead to nuclear war are made by governments. The consequences would be suffered by everyone. Everything described in this video exists as a possibility, not a certainty. Nuclear arsenals exist. Launch systems are operational. The geopolitical tensions that could lead to their use persist. Right now, approximately 12,500 nuclear warheads exist in the world. Roughly 3,700 of them are deployed and ready to launch. But the missiles have not been launched. The firestorms have not been lit. The soot is not in the stratosphere. Every day that this remains true is another day where the outcome can be changed. Nuclear war is not like an asteroid impact or a supervolcanic eruption. It requires human decisions. It can be prevented by human decisions. The weapons were built by humans. The policies that govern their use were designed by humans. The tensions that make their use thinkable are the product of human choices, which means the future is not fixed. The family in Buenos Aires does not have to emerge into a grey sky. The crops do not have to fail. 6 billion people do not have to starve. These outcomes are possible, but they are not inevitable. Throughout the Cold War, there were moments when nuclear war seemed imminent. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm, the Able Archer exercise. Each time, disaster was avoided, sometimes by deliberate diplomacy, sometimes by individual courage, sometimes by sheer luck. We cannot rely on luck forever. The treaties that limited nuclear arsenals during the Cold War have largely collapsed. New nuclear powers have emerged. Tensions between major powers are rising again. The risk is not decreasing. If anything, many experts believe it is increasing. But the weapons are still in their silos. The bombers are still on the ground. The submarines are still at their stations waiting for orders that have not been given. Nuclear war would end the world as we know it. But the war has not happened. The question is not whether we can survive nuclear war. The question is whether we're going to make sure we never have to. That question is not rhetorical. It demands an answer from everyone who understands what is at stake.